Hi, y'all. Welcome to Married to a Shrink. In this podcast, you will join me, Allie, a seasoned licensed couples and sex therapist, as we have conversations with my partner, Michael, for candid insights into what it is like to be partnered and married to a therapist and all the deep intricacies that have to do with relationships and balancing parenting and intimacy and all the components that come with maintenance and repair and creation of romance and relationship dynamics just in general. So today we are going to be talking about communication, which is one of the bedrocks, foundations for a successful relationship. And so first kind of question I want to ask you is how would you say your communication was when we first started dating?
It had a lot of room for improvement when we first started dating. I wouldn't say it was a strength. Certainly like to communicate, but was certainly not a strength in regards to building a long-term relationship
What
with
do you mean
somebody.
you like to communicate?
I can be known to be verbose in some ways.
You're
In a
chatty.
social setting.
Yeah. But you're more social than I am, I think. But how do you think your communication has altered since I've brought the skill sets that I teach my clients into our own marriage?
Oh, it's vastly improved. In terms of just how I communicate with you. And then I've kind of taken those skills and I've applied it to my personal life with regards to how I talk to my parents or how I talk with superiors at work or even our children.
What are the challenges that you had with communication?
I was very conflict avoidant, still am conflict avoidant. But I was very much so, I would push things under the rug and I would avoid topics to communicate about. Oftentimes I found myself not expressing how I truly felt about something, whether it had been driven from fear. Oftentimes it was maybe feelings of being judged for what it was I was going to say. But I've gotten a lot more comfortable in my skin and less fear-based, and feel just more open in being able to express and communicate, especially with you.
I feel like what you're referring to right now is those more like deeper conversations. I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that you think that you have become more comfortable with those deeper conversations, because I think for me, I still crave more of them. It's hard. I find it hard to get you to move past sometimes the surface level on some of the stuff. So it's interesting from your perspective that has vastly grown for you since we've been together.
I can acknowledge that there's certainly more room to grow, to have deeper conversations. It may be a little bit more, I can't think of all the layers of the Earth's crust, but it's not the outer layer anymore. It's gone down to maybe
We're not
the
at the
second.
core yet, though.
We're not to the core.
So that's some of that more deeper conversation. And I hear that. Like, I know I crave more of that, but I also can recognize that that is a growth process and that, to your point, you have come a long way from even being able to broach some of these more challenging conversations. So what do you think have been some of the more challenging topics that we have had to navigate and that have been really uncomfortable for you, and that we had to utilize skill sets that I brought in from being a therapist into our relationship? We had to pull out of that tool bag for these conversations.
Certainly. Sex and intimacy, probably first and foremost, was probably one of the most difficult one. dealing with past traumas was difficult, related to a prior relationship, and then just family dynamics, and growth of family, I think, were the four big ones.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the intimacy and sex, we'll do a whole episode on it because it is a doozy. But yeah, that has been, and we kind of started on the last episode. We kind of went there a little bit. But yeah, I think that has been a challenged conversation. Because I think there's been a lot of misconceived notions that you have had about intimacy in general and sex. And we kind of talked about how a lot of your references and how you built your paradigm about sex was through media. And, and that was a challenge for me to kind of navigate. And like you said, having to navigate you through past traumas when we're also trying to build something, that is where it has been, yes, my skill sets that I was able to bring into the relationship were very helpful for us. And I don't think we would be where we are right now had we not had those skill sets. We maybe would have crumbled. Would you agree with that statement? Because we had some major stressors.
We definitely encountered a lot of major stressors. I don't feel there was ever... I don't feel we're ever to the point where we were going to crumble. I feel
That's
like
fair.
we both cared
yeah.
so much about each other and about our relationship and our family that we would have gotten through it. I have complete confidence that that's the case.
That's fair.
But we definitely have experienced a lot of turmoil and, a lot of those stressors that they talk about that break a relationship. We've had a lot of them.
All.
We've had a lot of them in a short period of time.
The only one we haven't experienced is
death of family.
Knock on wood.
Yes, knock on wood.
That is the only one we have not experienced. But all the other ones came our way, and they came our way within our first 3 years.
And oftentimes we were juggling a couple of them at one time.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is where therapeutically I have a lot of folks come in at the 2-year mark and the 7-year mark, right? Because that's the fun and some of that honeymoon phase has worn off, and that's when the annoyances are starting to become less annoying and moving more into the realm of resentfulness and pain. And people are starting to deal with more influences into the relationships, and if they don't have the communication skills to navigate that, then that's when they come in for couples therapy, because they want to make sure that they can maintain, and they just can't because they don't have the skill sets, right? And so, to your point, I backtrack. We would not have crumbled, but that was dramatic, which is unlike me, but there we go. But without those skill sets, I think we'd be in a completely different place.
Absolutely.
Than we were right now. Because I had the skill sets. I was already bringing into relationships, and we were in couples therapy, and we were in individual therapy. And even then, it was still hard.
Absolutely.
Right? And so the third one, the family, I think that has been one of our more recent and more challenging conversations, because we are so for those who don't know, we're foster adoptive parents, and we have been doing this for a few years now, and we have had situations of which there has been opportunity for a placement to become more permanent, or not more permanent. There is not more in permanency. You're either permanent or you're not. And we have had to navigate those conversations when we have not been on the same page. And communicating through that, I think, has been one of our more recent challenging, in-depth conversations. Lean into that more. Tell me.
Well, coming into partnership with you was something that you were very adamant about and you were in process of doing and looking into before we ever partnered together. So when I partnered with you, it was certainly something that wasn't on my radar to foster, to adopt. But being your partner, I saw just how beautiful of a gift it is to this world and to the children that we bring into our home. Our daughters have gotten on board with this process. But like you mentioned, it's made for some difficult conversations. There's been times where I necessarily wasn't ready for a placement or the timing just wasn't right, but I knew that it was something that was important to you, and trying to find the appropriate way to communicate that, making sure to get us onto the same page or getting us to at least to align to make a decision. It certainly made for some difficult conversations.
Getting it back on the same page, which was challenging. Because I think there's certain things in a relationship that are you can't do halfway, right? Or you can't be more inventive around, right? Like you can be with someone for 20 years and decide to create your own type of partnership, but choose not to get married, right? You can structure things and make decisions around things like where to live or change of jobs or career that you can change your mind again later. Children is not one of them. And so, I've worked with a number of couples who that's why they came in, was the pain point of one was adamant that they did not want to expand family. The other one very much wanted to expand family. And they both were hopeful that in therapy it would change the other person's mind either way, right? And which it doesn't. You can't, that's not how the therapeutic process works, and it becomes, because you can't compromise on children, right? And so it becomes more of a thought process of, okay, well, how can we, if we're staying coupled, what are we going to do with family planning? And for some couples, it was just such a non-negotiable that they were unable to stay partnered, right? Because one was adamant that I don't want this. And so they were unable to sustain because, again, that's a non-negotiable. And so I think with that conversation and with non-negotiable conversations in general, it becomes about making sure that you're feeling, making sure that you're heard, getting as to why you feel the way you feel, but not have the expectation that you're going to change the other person's mind, and then let time kind of sit on it while you're also trying to understand the other person's perspective, right? And then organically, a lot of times it does come to its resolution, whatever that resolution may be. But what a lot of couples try to do, and I know you initially tried to do this, was to bulldoze through and be like, no, this is why we cannot do this. This is why. And it was like, I understand your points. I hear them, but they contradict how I am feeling, so I am unable to take them and accept them as part of my paradigm shift. Like, you're wanting to shift my paradigm, yet I'm not feeling heard, and I don't feel like you are understanding why I am wanting what I am wanting, right? And so that's part of moving through some of these really challenging, non-negotiable conversations. When I mean non-negotiable, I mean things that they have to be a yes or a no.
Right. There's no halfway.
There's no halfway. There's no yes, but we can. It's like there's a yes or a no are the only options, is really making sure that you don't bulldoze through with like, no, this is why we shouldn't do this, or this is why we should do this. It's more of a conversation around, this is why I feel the way I feel. I want to understand why you feel the way you feel. And then let's let some time pass. Let's touch base on if we are feeling differently about something, right? And then if so much time passes, then you start to have the conversation around, what does this mean for our future, right? But it never came to that because, again, organically, we got to the place where I understood why you felt the way you felt. I feel like you understood why I felt the way I felt. And then after some time, some things fell into place where I fell on your side. And I was like, no, we don't need to be moving forward with adoption right now. Mm-hmm. Right? Are you remembering that differently?
No, that's how I remember it. You definitely kind of talked through the process there. I think that was one of my tendencies, was just kind of bulldozing through, trying to get my point driven home. That wasn't necessarily intent, and I know that's something that I'm sure we'll talk about as intent. But yes, we got to a place where we saw each other's point of view. We understood how we each felt, and then we made a decision in terms of what was best for us in that moment. And, here we are. We're, fostering again.
Yeah. But I think the key points were not to bulldoze through, to make sure that both people are felt heard, and to let some time kind of navigate, to not make those big decisions over.
Sure. Sure. And I think sometimes, especially with regards to, the foster process, some of it is very time sensitive, and you don't have a lot of time in which to mull over things. Sometimes things are emergency placements, and you get a phone call, you've got a few minutes to make a decision. But generally speaking, that I think your process that you talk about is accurate, and ultimately leads to success.
Yeah. So let's talk everyday communication. So we just talked about the deeper, like those harder hit conversations. But I feel like it's the everyday communication where it can be a real challenge. Yes, no?
I think it's more of a challenge. I think you take it a little bit more as a challenge than I do.
Elaborate.
You being a therapist, we've talked about how you like to be heard, you like to be understood. You feel that's your biggest fear, is not being understood and known. You do yearn for those deep conversations, and I think we talked about how by nature or by practice I can be a little bit more surface level, and I'm starting to get deeper. You want to take things very deep, and oftentimes it's more difficult for me to do it.
So I hear and I acknowledge what you're saying, but that's not what I'm referring to in this. When I'm saying like everyday conversation, I'm talking more about like logistics.
Oh, okay.
Like the everyday because we don't have these deep conversations about family planning and expansion and like trauma every day. Like that's not, to your point, I find deep conversation fun and entertaining. Like I enjoy that. But that's not what I was referring to. I was speaking more to the everyday, the logistics of communication. Like, for example, how, you called yesterday and when you're getting off work, and you said, what are we having for dinner? And my question back was, I'm sorry, is that no longer your domain? Like, because that had been an established domain for you, as in with our partnership, you are responsible for
I prepare most of the dinners.
for dinner.
Yes.
And so like that to me was a miscommunication. I was then confused because I was like, wait, did we have a conversation about needing to shift this domain? And you were like, well, no. I was like, so why are you calling to ask me what we're having for dinner? Right? Like, or another example is at dinner, how you kept getting up from the table. And I was like, what are you doing? Like, normally in appropriate communication, if you're going to get up, you say, oh, just hold that thought real quick. I'm going to be right back. Or keep talking. I'm going to, I'm putting my dish away. But you have a tendency to say nothing.
Yes.
And then I'm sitting there still talking, but there's no one sitting across from the table from me. So it's like, at best, it's awkward. At worst, I get my feelings get hurt because I'm just like, I was literally just talking.
I know, and I'm sorry.
And you're like, off. And I was like, what? It's like, that's what I'm talking about, the everyday communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the logistics.
The
yes.
small little, like, yeah, like, hey, I'm about to do XYZ, or hey, I know I'm responsible for dinner. That's what we've agreed to as a couple. Do we have XYZ at the house?
Right.
Like, so
right. No, I think the
talk to me
questions-
about the struggles you have with that everyday small communication. Because again, this is super common. The couples that I see is a lot of times they come with they just don't have the small skill sets to communicate about those everyday type of items.
I think it's the lack of questions and making poor assumptions or making an assumption in general. So going back to yesterday's example, I was getting off of work. I knew when I left for work there wasn't a whole lot in the fridge in which was going to prepare a satisfactory meal. And my question probably should have been, hey, Allie, by chance, did you stop at the store today and pick up any ingredients for which I could use to cook dinner?
Which is my domain. I do the grocery shopping.
Did you have a preference on picking up dinner? I should have posed it more of as a question instead of this blanket, hey, what's the thought for dinner? I should have been more specific with my question. And I think that would have yielded a response in which, action could have been taken. So,
well, I think where I feel like the struggle becomes is, as a therapist, I am aware that communication is a constant, how do I say this? Like it's always running in the background, right? So it is best practice to, as you're doing something, to voice it, like for that stream of consciousness to kind of come forward, like, oh, I'm going to get up now. Oh, can you hold that thought real quick? Oh, I know I'm in charge for dinner. What do we have in the fridge, right? I'm aware of that, but I find that you aren't.
mm-hmm.
And
I
so
think
that's where it's, yeah.
I think some of that is just personally, my mind sometimes jumps 2 steps ahead from where I am in the moment. And it's like looking back, I'm like, I should have said, hey, love, I'm going to go get myself a glass of water, or I'm going to go put this dish in the sink, or I've got something sticky on my hands. I'm going to go wash my hands really quick. Hold that thought.
Or keep talking.
Keep
I'm
talking.
listening.
I'm just in the kitchen. I recognize that, but I think my mind sometimes just jumps 2 steps ahead, and I bypass those steps.
And I hear that, but like, then I don't feel like seen as a human if I'm literally talking to someone and they get up and walk away, right? Or in a different capacity, I feel frustrated when you call and say, hey, what are we having for dinner, when I've got so much going on, because that's your domain, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's in those small day-to-days that I feel like we are still growing, because it used to be whenever I would call that out and say, hey, hun, like, that hurt my feelings that you just got up while I was still talking, you would get highly defensive. Highly defensive and reactionary. And I feel like that has lessened. And now you will move more towards the apology. But like we're going to talk about in another episode, the art of the apology is still something that I feel like is a skill set I don't feel like you've still obtained. Would you agree with that statement?
I think generally speaking, there's some improvement. There's some room for more improvement.
Yeah. Like where I feel sometimes mischaracterized because like you kind of, like it organically happened while we were sitting here on this couch talking. I asked you about day-to-day conversation and you automatically took it to, well, Allie only wants to talk about the deep stuff and I don't always want to talk about the deep stuff. And right? Like, and sometimes that's frustrating for me because I feel mischaracterized. And then I also feel like I'm unable to navigate some of these small things. I'm like, I don't even want to have a conversation about it. I just want it to be, I want what we conversated about before to be done. Like, I don't want to have 3 conversations about something. I want to have one and then us have a second conversation if that needs to shift. Because I feel like sometimes I feel characterized as like unreasonable or no, unreasonable, I think is how I feel. Like you characterize me sometimes in terms of like, well, Allie expects this, so I need to do this. And it's like, no, I just expect a conversation if something has changed. And I feel like that misstep happens more frequently than I get comfortable with, because that's where I get frustrated, where I'm like, I'm cool if things change. I expect things to shift and change. You can no longer do dinner. That's cool, right? Like I can no longer do our grocery shopping. That's cool. We just have to have a conversation about it. And I think, you know how I am with the 4 agreements, great philosophical components for those who don't know it. Look it up. But one of those is not to make assumptions. And I feel like that is the antithesis of communication, is assumption making. And I feel like that is unfortunately one of your go-tos when it comes to communicating.
I agree. And I think you mentioned you feel that you're characterized as being unreasonable. I don't feel that you're unreasonable. I know you feel that way based on the actions.
I feel like that because of your reactions.
Based on the reactions, but I don't feel that way. So I think that's where that communication gap we're trying to shrink it.
For sure. But I also like, you will find that, I think you know this, that it doesn't really matter, like, if, how do I say this? The intent doesn't matter as much as how that made me feel. And you have a hard time accepting that something that you did, that it hurt my feelings, or that you have room for improvement. Because that has also been one of the defenses, is because of how you were raised and because of just the notions of that, you have historically struggled to receive feedback, especially of the critical variety. Mm-hmm. And I think communication is such an integral part of any relationship. And your skill sets were null. There were none of them. And so it came in, you had no skill sets for communication, and then you were defensive whenever I would try to navigate a conversation with you, even small ones, and not deep ones or any of that. And so it became, the day-to-day became challenging to be in partnership together because we were struggling to converse about small things that we had already talked about and decided on. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do.
You know, like to circle back to this example before we kind of close this out is like the conversation we had about dinner when I responded with, is that my domain now? Because we haven't had a conversation about how that's my domain. You're like, no, I'm sorry, I should have rephrased that differently, right? Before, if I had responded with, like when I say before, I mean like last year or before that, if I had responded with, hey, hun, is that my domain now? Because we haven't had a conversation about that. I thought dinner is your domain. You would have gotten very reactive.
I completely agree that I would have, my reaction would have been differently than what it was, say, last night.
Yeah. And so I think this may be a conversation that has to kind of be continued because communication is so important. And so regarding those small, everyday logistical items, it's about realigning in a calm and polite way with validation and expectation setting, right? Because relationships can die on implicit expectations, those expectations that are never said. So we always have to make sure that we're moving our expectations into the explicit and making sure that we are saying what we expect. And that's all communication is this is what I expect from XYZ. This is what I expect from you. This is what I expect from an action. This is what I expect in being cared for, whatever it is. And I think where people really struggle, and I feel like you are an example of that, is when someone lays an expectation and they go to a place of judgment and or they feel criticized or their self-esteem or something is off, that they're unable to see the communication as just an expectation set, and they see it as an attack or some sort of criticism. And so that is where you've got to kind of bring out the communication to make it truly about, it's not personal in terms of the expectation, and to validate and then appropriately and lovingly expect the expectation. Like being able to say, hey, hon, I thought dinner was your domain. Is it not anymore? Because if it's not, that's cool. We just need to have a conversation. Real chill, right? Mm-hmm. And then that brings the partner to say, no, it still is. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked that in that way. Or they say, actually, yeah, I'm struggling to make sure that I can continuously make dinner. We need to have a conversation about that when I get home. But what do we have in the fridge now? Or I think I may just pick up something, right? It's about seeing communication for what it needs to get you to, and about validating and then setting the expectation and having that short expectation conversation with love and respect, and making sure that you don't move into a mindset of that I'm being attacked or I am being criticized for someone to communicate with me, to lay an expectation, because someone should always be able to say what they expect from another person, right? That's part of the boundary paradigm. So any other insights or comments you want to give to people that you have learned about communicating within marriage and long-term partnership? Things that I've taught you or that you've learned other places that you feel have really added value to be able to communicate?
I think the biggest thing is to make sure you're being true to yourself and expressing your feelings, to make less assumptions, to be open to feedback and criticism, and willing to grow and learn as a person. I can acknowledge that I still have room to grow from a communication sense. I want to continue, and I'm going to continue to work on growing there. But really being in this relationship with you, and you being a therapist and bringing in, your trained skill sets, it's really just called to light some shortcomings and some areas that that some focus has been put on.
Well, and like we talked about last episode, I am a stickler for word choice. And so I'm going to circle back to the word criticism. I want to make sure that people understand that giving feedback, especially when it's about your feelings and how you feel about something, and someone takes it as like an attack, that isn't always a fair characterization, right? Because they may feel like they're being criticized, but you're not being criticized if someone says, "You hurt my feelings."
Right.
But you may feel like you're being criticized. And that, again, is part of those psychodynamics that come with trauma, come with past experience, come with things that can create challenge in communication. When a person feels like they are being criticized, when the other individual is just expressing appropriate emotion towards an action that you did and how that made them feel, right? And you, as the person who kindly and respectfully expressed, you are not responsible for holding the notion that that was critical. That was the receiving individual who took it as critical when it is not a critical action to express that someone has hurt your feelings or that someone's crossed a boundary with you. That's not a critical action. But that doesn't always mean that people will not take it as a critical action. And so I just wanted to clarify that. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense.
Because I know that I have expressed to you, hey, you hurt my feelings, or this crossed a boundary for me. Can we not do this again? And you got reactive and you took it as a criticism.
Right. I oftentimes will feel shame for it. And I get down on myself for it.
Yeah. Which the difference between shame and guilt is shame is I am bad and guilt is I did something bad. We all need to experience guilt. Guilt is an appropriate emotion and it has its place. But shame doesn't have its place, right? Because you are not bad because you hurt my feelings. You are not bad because you crossed my boundary. You just may feel guilty that you did so. And depending on the offense, there could be appropriateness in that guilt. But to your point, what happens is you take guilt to shame automatically, and then you get reactive, and then you get critical. Or you don't get critical, my apologies. You perceive it as critical. And then I am left standing with oh my goodness, I can't get validation from the fact that this individual just hurt my feelings or crossed one of my boundaries. And that is part of that communication process that is paramount to be able to establish intimacy. Because if you cannot express that someone has crossed a boundary to you and they don't accept that and validate that, how can you ever hold a true connection with someone? And so I just wanted to kind of circle back on that because like we've talked about, words do matter and their different meanings have different outcomes for relationships and dynamics. And so with all of that, a lot of communication moves into power struggle. Right? And that is something that we're going to talk about in the next episode is how power struggles occur within a relationship, how you navigate power struggles, and how you move through the communication of a power struggle dynamic because they are often, especially when you have two individuals who are passionate about things and care about things. And it's a part of every dynamic. Again, unless you're apathetic. I mean, you don't ever want to be apathetic because that means you're not working. So in our next episode, we will be talking about power dynamics, how they occur within the relationship, how you navigate through them via communication, because communication is going to be a topic that flows through a lot of our episodes because there are certain things and certain ways of which we should be discussing and moving through items that have to do with relationships and intimacy and marriage. And so that's what we're going to talk about next time. But thank y'all so much for tuning in. And we will catch you next time on Married to a Shrink. See y'all later. Bye, y'all.
Have a good one, y'all. Love you, babe.